Morning, everyone. So first of all, allow me to join others in thanking the Bank of Japan for the opportunity to participate in what has been an extremely interesting and very thought-provoking conference. So our next session is very aptly titled Mind the Gap When Exiting Low for Long. Just thinking back to yesterday, I mean, one of the key themes that we discussed was the importance of the predictability of monetary policy, and in that context, the relative merits of simple rules versus discretion. Now, as we all know, even in normal times, effectively communicating the central bank's reaction function and the outlook for the key variables that enter that reaction function can be a challenge. This challenge can be even greater when policy has been constrained at the effective lower bound for an extended period of time. In effect, the central bank's desired level of the policy rate, or the shadow rate, and by extension, the duration of the ELB episode is unknown and must therefore be inferred by private agents. These challenges can be compounded when nuances such as the central bank's objective function, the high degree of conditionality of extraordinary forward guidance, or the central bank's estimate of the neutral rate are either not well understood or ignored by the private sector. In the Bank of Canada's recent review of extraordinary measures that we took during the pandemic, which included forward guidance, and was published at the beginning of this year, we stressed the need in the future to place even greater emphasis on the state dependency of forward guidance when at the ELB, and to frequently remind market participants of the main variables that we are monitoring to determine when liftoff from the ELB may occur. Preeminent among these indicators are those that provide information about future inflation pressures relative to our target, both from the demand and from the supply side of the economy. More specifically, the bank acknowledged in our report that large and persistent supply shocks can drive a wedge between inflation and traditional quantity measures of economic slack, such as output or labor market gaps. For this reason, communications about the timing of liftoff from the ELB should focus primarily on the outlook for inflation pressures rather than measures of economic slack alone. This doesn't preclude slack as an important determinant, but rather acknowledges that supply factors whose persistence we cannot know in real time can also affect underlying inflation. So, in the spirit of avoiding the pretense of knowledge, we must remain humble and avoid the temptation to overcommit when designing forward guidance. Now with that, allow me to introduce our presenter, Daisuke Ikeda, who is head of the Economic and Financial Studies Division, Institute for Monetary and Economic Studies at the Bank of Japan. Daisuke has written extensively in the areas of unconventional monetary policy, digital money, asset bubbles, leverage, and the business cycle. He holds a PhD in economics from Northwestern University and has a master's from the University of Tokyo. So please join me in welcoming Daisuke.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's truly an honor to be able to present this paper to you all. This is a joint paper with Wataru Hagio, Koji Takahashi, and Keisuke Yoshida, all with the BOJ. So typical disclaimer applies. The views expressed in this presentation are mine. So as the title of the paper suggests, this paper is about exiting a prolonged period of low interest rates, so-called low for long. Okay, this chart shows the short-term interest rate in Japan from 1990. So around 1990, the interest rate was high. And so this is a time when I learned about positive interest rates. So looking at my small banking deposit account. So that was when I first learned interest rates. And then in 1995, interest rate was lowered to 50 basis points. That was the beginning of low for long. That was when I was a high school student. And 2004, I joined the bank. And so my entire career at the central bank has been with low interest rates for now. And now the interest rate is 50 basis points, and the Japanese economy is at the exit of low for long. And in this situation, there's been an increasing interest in neutral rates, R star, or terminal rates. So this chart shows the frequency of words pertaining to R star neutral rates from central bank speeches, from the Bank of Japan on the left and all central banks on the right. Especially in 24, there's been a sharp rise in the frequency of words about neutral rates. And this is understandable, especially in Japan, because the BOJ ended yield curve control and negative interest rate policy in 24 and started to raise interest rates. So these two observations motivate this paper. And in light of the theme of these conferences, new challenges for monetary policy, so here is a challenge I'd like to consider and examine in this paper. So the short-term interest rate is a primary tool of monetary policy, and keeping interest rates low for long supports the economy, especially in a low inflation regime, as many central banks did before the recent surge in inflation. However, low for long policy may induce agents to believe lower for longer interest rates. And when the time comes and interest rates are raised, this belief gap is corrected, and the correction of the gap can be perceived as supply tightening. So far, all developed economies but Japan exited low for long, and arguably there were some disruptions in the financial market and the banking system. And the key point is that policy regimes can change quickly by affecting agents' expectations and beliefs, but the agents' beliefs may not change quickly. And so this may generate a volatility in the real economy and markets. So we examine this potential channel of low for long monetary policy theoretically and empirically. So this is what we do in the paper. So we built a new Keynesian model that featured three things. One, agents learning about monetary policy rule, and two, the effective lower bound, and three, forward guidance with imperfect credibility. So we need these three things because we want to examine the implications of low for long policy. And we use the model to simulate low for long scenarios and study how a belief gap between what agents believe about central banks and the actual monetary policy. So we want to study how this belief gap grows in the model and study the underlying mechanisms of the evolution of this belief gap. And finally, and importantly, we estimate a perceived monetary policy rule using professional forecast data in Japan to support this theoretical prediction, theoretical model. Okay, our findings are threefold. First, low for long policy can induce expansion during ELB, but it is followed by contraction during the exit. So in the model, we allow agents to learn about monetary policy parameters, including nominal neutral rate, I star, and coefficients on inflation and output in the monetary policy rule. And during the low for long policy, agents come to believe that interest rates will be lower for longer, mainly driven by a decrease in the perceived I star. And then when interest rate is raised, this belief gap is corrected and perceived as monetary tightening during the exit. So this generates an economic contraction. And second, low credibility about forward guidance amplifies this boom and bust-like phenomenon. The less credible forward guidance becomes, the more the agents attribute the zero interest rate to a low perceived I star, so generating a belief gap and this precipitating contraction when this belief gap is corrected during the exit. And third, our estimation supports and underpins our theoretical prediction. So especially we estimated perceived I star using professional forecast data, and this estimated perceived I star responds to a monetary policy supplies positively as predicted by the model with learning. Okay, so let me touch on related literature to place this paper in the extensive literature on monetary policy. The most related to our paper is Bodenstein, Hebden, and Winkler, who study monetary policy rule learning by agents under the zero lower bound. So they consider a switch from flexible inflation targeting rule to price level targeting rule under zero lower bound. And of course, our paper is closely related to Chris Elseg's paper and my discussant later, Spence Crane's paper recently, and of course builds upon papers by Dr. Williams and Dr. Orphanides, previous work on monetary policy with learning. And secondly, our modeling of forward guidance with imperfect credibility builds upon Bodenstein, Hebden, and Nunes, and we need imperfect credibility to make it to capture some degree of imperfection perceived by agents in practice, and also to address forward guidance puzzle. So it is forward guidance in the model is too powerful to be true, and so we need imperfect credibility to address this issue. And also, this paper is related to those pointing out potential side effects of law for long. And Dr. Orphanides actually pointed out the forward guidance trap. So the central banks can become behind the curve if their hands are tied by forward guidance and hit by supply shocks. And actually, our mechanism of learning exacerbates this forward guidance trap, as I show you later. And finally, our estimation is related to Bauer, Fugger, and Sandram. Okay, in the rest of my presentation, I will walk you through the model and show you the main results, simulation results, and then present empirical analysis to support the theoretical model, then conclude. Okay, so this is the basic standard New Keynesian model. And there are a few variables. Y hat indicates output, pi hat inflation, I hat interest rate. And the first equation is the standard Euler equation modified to include additional discounting M, which is equal to 1 or less than 1. So this additional discounting can be derived from behavioral New Keynesian model of Gabex or the tractable heterogeneous agent New Keynesian model of Bilby. So as we see, this discounting helps us to generate reasonable scenarios without causing unrealistically severe deflation or decreasing output. And second equation is the standard Phillips curve. Today's inflation depends on output gap and expected future inflation. And third equation is the effective lower bound constraint. Interest rate is equal to the notional rate if notional rate is positive, but otherwise it is stuck at the lower bound. And the final equation is monetary policy rule for the notional rate, which depends on the past interest rate and responds to inflation and the output. So we have yet to introduce learning, but in this model, agents learn about monetary policy parameters, I star, and coefficients on inflation and output in the monetary policy rule, as we will see later. Okay, let me introduce forward guidance. So we consider a scenario where severe negative shock hits in period 1, and central bank observe this negative shock and responds promptly by announcing forward guidance. It will keep the interest rate at the effective lower bound for an extended period until period T1. However, this forward guidance is imperfectly believed by agents. So agents are unsure about whether forward guidance will be actually implemented or not. So to capture this imperfection, we introduce parameter Q. So agents believe that forward guidance is implemented with probability Q. In the case of Q equal 1, this is perfect credibility. Q equal 0, no credibility. Okay. So in practice, Q captures the agent's trust in central banks or central bank communications, discretions, or the nature of uncertainty, etc. Okay, so because learning is a core part of the model, let me walk you through the key assumptions of learning. So agents, in this model, agents, as I said, do not know monetary policy parameters, i.e. stir and coefficients on inflation and output in the monetary policy rule. And they don't observe monetary policy shocks either. But what agents do know is the structure of the economy and parameters, other parameters, except for monetary policy parameters. And also the terminal date of forward guidance is known, and every period, agents observe macroeconomic variables such as interest rate, output, and inflation. And these variables, macroeconomic variables, are summarized by vector x. And agents make decisions based on their prior belief about monetary policy parameters inherited from previous period. And we assume the anticipated utility approach, meaning that essentially agents make decisions as if monetary policy parameters are fixed at their prior values, today and future. So monetary policy parameters can change, but they treat these parameters as fixed at their prior values, and then make decisions. So this is the anticipated utility approach. And then agents update beliefs about monetary policy parameters upon observing macroeconomic variables. And in a non-ELB regime, this is very standard. And so the updating algorithm is used by standard Kalman filter. But in the forward guidance regime, with probability Q, they observe interest rate at 0. But with probability Q, they believe it is due to forward guidance. So there is no updating, no information about parameter values. But with probability 1 minus Q, they are observing 0 interest rate because of low notional rate below the lower bound. So this is new information. And so they update parameter values in this case, and using algorithm developed by Bodenstein, Hevden, and Winkler I mentioned before. And so before showing simulation results, let me explain what is belief gap and how is it related to perceived monetary tightening. So consider a non-ELB regime so that interest rate is equal to the notional rate, and then interest rate is given by the systematic part of monetary policy rule that responds to inflation and output and past interest rate, plus structural idiosyncratic monetary policy shock. And the perceived monetary policy shock is given by the difference between the actual interest rate and systematic part of monetary policy rule under their beliefs, believed parameter values. And so the perceived monetary policy shock consists of two parts: structural idiosyncratic shock, epsilon T and P, plus belief gap. Specifically, if agents believe interest rates lower, then this gives rise to negative belief gap. And so the perceived, giving rise to perceived monetary policy tightening. Okay, so let me quickly touch on parameter values because I need to parameterize the model to simulate low for long scenarios. And key parameters are the discounting M, which is set at 0.85, and standard deviation of monetary policy shock is set at 10 basis points, and standard deviation parameters that govern how monetary policy parameters, the belief about monetary policy parameter is changing, is set at 6 basis points based on the quick estimation on the I star using Japanese data. And standard deviation pertaining to coefficient on inflation is the same as the paper by Bodenstein and other authors. Okay, so first, I'd like to construct baseline scenario of low for long. So in this baseline scenario, there is no learning. Okay, later I introduce learning to highlight its role. And I want this scenario as simple as possible. And so in period 0, the economy is in steady state. And in period 1, severe negative shock, demand shock hits. And there is only one shock, but it is very large and persistent. And without forward guidance, as shown in the left panel, red line, the interest rate is binding for 20 quarters, 5 years. And with forward guidance, the interest rate is kept at ELB for additional 8 quarters, 2 years. And blue line is the baseline scenario. And middle panel shows output, and right panel shows the inflation. And looking at blue line, so there is a severe decline in output and inflation, and the recovery is slow. And you can see that, so in this baseline scenario, the degree of imperfect credibility about forward guidance is set at 0.7. And with this value, forward guidance is moderately effective, as can be seen by the difference between blue line and red line. But if forward guidance is perfectly credible, Q equal 1, actually output and inflation increase. So this is reminiscent of the forward guidance puzzle. Okay, then let's introduce learning. So in these charts, the blue line indicates the model with learning, and red dashed line indicates the model without learning. So looking at the middle chart and right chart, output and inflation, relative to the model without learning, you can see some expansion in the latter phase of low for long, and sharp decrease in output and inflation when the economy exits low for long. So why does this boom and bust-like phenomena occur in this model? So let's behind what's going on in this model. So middle chart shows perceived monetary policy shock, blue line. So when the economy exits, the agents perceive sharp monetary policy tightening, as shown in the blue line in the middle chart. So 40, 50 basis points perceived tightening. So why does this perceived tightening happen to agents? That is because agents perceived neutral rate has decreased a lot during low for long, as shown in the middle panel light blue line. So in the beginning of low for long, there is no change in the perceived I star in the monetary policy rule, but as the interest rate is kept low for long, it starts decreasing, and under forward guidance, it decreases even more. And this perception of low nominal neutral rate, I star, is corrected when the economy exits low for long. So regarding other parameters, agents learn coefficients on inflation and output, there are no significant change, as shown in the right panel. Okay, so let me explain why there is a nonlinear evolution of perceived I star in this model. So initially, no change, but as interest rate is kept low for long, it starts decreasing. So these two charts show the prior and the posterior about the systematic part of the monetary policy rule in period 2 and period 16. So in period 2, this is just after a very severe negative shock hits the economy, and the agents observe severe deflation and severe decrease in output. So it is very obvious that interest rate has to be set 0. And observing 0 interest rate doesn't provide, convey any information, useful information. So there is no change in the prior and posterior, as shown in the left panel. But in period 16, the economy has recovered to some extent, and the output gap is still negative but close to 0, and inflation is still below 2%, but becomes close to 2%. So before observing zero interest rate, there was possibility, according to their belief, that interest rate could have been positive. But they actually observe zero interest rate, and this is new information. And the agents think that they are observing zero interest rate partly because their perceived neutral rate, I star, is low. So updating their belief to the left, as shown in the right panel. Okay. And let's see how forward guidance affects this belief gap. So the belief gap is the largest just before the lift of interest rate. And this belief gap widens more if the credibility of forward guidance becomes lower, as shown in the left panel, and as the duration of forward guidance becomes longer. So forward guidance affects the belief gap, especially the degree of credibility of forward guidance. And these results suggest caveats to the conduct of monetary policy, especially forward guidance. And then I consider alternative scenarios. First, when this is the case of inflationary shocks hitting the economy during the period of forward guidance, so in light of the recent surge in inflation. So the blue line is the model with learning, and red line is the model without learning. So looking at the right panel, inflation, you see a sharp rise in inflation, in this case, around 10% in the model with learning when inflationary shocks hit during unexpected inflationary shocks hit during the period of forward guidance. So our learning mechanism in this model exacerbates the forward guidance trap argued by Professor Ofanides. And so if this is a big if, but if a central bank can observe a belief gap, the central bank may want to accommodate the belief. So in this case, we consider a central bank setting interest rate as believed by agents after the liftoff. So as the period of belief accommodation becomes longer after the liftoff, as shown in the right panel, the perceived monetary policy shock becomes smaller. So this result suggests that a central bank may want to consider accommodating beliefs if they can correctly observe a belief gap. Okay, so far this is all about theory, the new Keynesian model. So I want to show you empirical results to support this prediction. Okay? And so we estimate a perceived monetary policy rule using professional forecast data for Japan. And in doing so, we assume that forecasters believe the same monetary policy rule as we consider in the theoretical model. And also, we assume that we can get around the ELB constraint if we use the forecasted interest rate. Okay, then taking expectations of the both sides of monetary policy rule, our baseline specification is the second equation of this slide. The expected interest rate is given by, it depends on the constant term, and the expected lagged interest rate, and the expected inflation, and the expected output gap. So we can construct these variables using professional forecast data. And then perceived nominal neutral rate, perceived I star, is given by this constant term. Okay? And our estimation utilizes cross-sectional and time variations. Okay, so the data is a consensus forecast data, and this is the data frequency is monthly. So also we need to take into account which month forecasts were made. So actually our specification, what we estimate, is the equation to take care of this, the timing of forecast. Okay? And this chart shows the estimated perceived I star for Japan from 93 to 24. So we use a pooled ordinary least squares regression with a rolling window of 36 months. So there is a time change. So you can see a secular decline in the perceived I star with some fluctuations. And currently, in 2004, November, it is still in a low range. And so you may think that there may be room for correction. However, this is just the estimates of perceived I star, and this doesn't imply that this is due to belief-driven, but this may be due to actual decrease in R star, and for example, driven by demographics. So we want to need more evidence to support our theoretical model. So to do that, we derive testable prediction from the theoretical model with learning. So when we have learning, our model predicts that perceived I star in the monetary policy rule responds to surprise monetary policy shocks. And this chart shows the impulse response of perceived I star to monetary policy shocks in the model. And there is positive response. So we have positive response in the model with learning, but we don't in the model without learning. In the model with learning, we are observing this because observing monetary policy shocks, they don't know whether this is due to idiosyncratic structural monetary policy shock or a belief gap. But at least agents attribute this perceived monetary policy shock to a belief gap. And so I observed monetary policy tightening partly because my belief about monetary policy rule may be too low. So that's why I'm observing monetary policy perceived tightening. So I update my belief about I star. And so that's why in the theoretical model with learning, we see a positive response. So this is a testable prediction using the data. So we use local projection for the k period ahead perceived neutral rate and estimate the impulse responses. And we identify monetary policy surprises using high frequency data, changes in the 1-year JGB yield before and after days of monetary policy meetings and speeches. And that data sample is from 22 to 2024. So this is the result. So this is the estimated impact and the estimated response of estimated perceived I star to identified monetary policy shocks. And so you see positive response. And so this is consistent with the model with learning. So this supports our model's key mechanism, that is learning. Okay, so let me conclude. So this paper studies a new channel of low for long interest rates. And to do that, we build new Keynesian model with learning, the ELB, and forward guidance. And we also conduct empirical analysis to support the model. So, and this paper highlights a challenge facing central banks in normalizing low for long policy, and which can be quickly summarized as follows. So low for long policy is suitable in a low inflation regime, but it's not in a normal high inflation regime. So agents' beliefs may not adjust smoothly and quickly. So this gives rise to belief gaps, and when belief gaps are corrected, this will cause economic tightening, contraction. And our empirical analysis suggests that this challenge may be relevant in practice. Thank you very much.
Okay, so at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce our discussant this morning, Spencer Krane. Spencer is Senior Vice President and Senior Research Advisor in the Economic Research Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. In this capacity, Spencer manages the forecasts and briefings that the staff prepares for the Chicago Fed President in advance of each meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, coordinates other policy analyses for the Chicago Fed President, and conducts research in domestic macroeconomics. And I would be remiss not to mention that Spencer actually has a related paper to this morning's session, a very interesting 2023 co-authored paper entitled Learning Monetary Policy Strategies at the Effective Lower Bound with Sudden Surprises. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you very much for the Bank of Japan for organizing this great conference and inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. I really liked it a lot. As always, the normal disclaimer, these are my views and not those of the Chicago Fed or anywhere else in the system. So there are a lot of policies been put out there to counter the effective lower bound. Ever since Japan first hit it in the late 90s, people have been working on a lot of topics here. One policy that was out there was calendar-based forward guidance. We're going to hold rates down until a certain period. And that's what Daisuke and his co-authors study in this paper. There's certainly been a lot of other ones out there. Average inflation targeting, price level targeting, shadow rate makeup rules that John and Dave Reichschneider worked on, and various asymmetric rules that treat deviations in different fashions. A very important one being flexible average inflation targeting, where the central bank says, okay, I know I'm going to have a shortfall of inflation during the period of ELB. I'm going to promise to make it up afterwards. Now, these models, the theoretical ones, they generally work very well when you put in full information and rational expectations. Things just correct themselves automatically. But the world doesn't work that way. And you're going to have to learn the new policies. Agents haven't seen them before. And so I think what the message out of this model is that policy efficacy is going to be enhanced when markets and the public understand the policy and they see it as being credible. And in the learning process, that means, boy, the faster you learn it, the better you learn it, the more effective these policies are going to be. Like I said, these policies often work very well in a full information setting. And so I thought I'd put up another full information setting, and this is from the paper Stephen discussed that I've done with Leo Malosi and Matthias Rotner. And there we look at flexible average inflation targeting. And what agents don't know is how strong the central bank is going to react to that shortfall in inflation. So there's an unknown parameter in there that they have to learn. And if you look at the lower right-hand panel, I think this is a bit of a summary statistic for all of these models. The ELB forces what we like to call a bias, a downward bias to inflation or a downward bias to output, in the sense that if you can't counter it, the long-run distribution is going to be below target because you're eventually over time, you're going to hit with some shocks. Those shocks are going to throw you to the ELB. You can't do about it. You're going to average below target there. The summary statistic we're using here are the long-run inflation expectations, and this is the mean of the stochastic steady state of this model. So if you look at the lower right, that dark line is what we get from a standard Taylor rule in this framework. The inflation is at 25 basis points below the 2% target. Okay? And this has to do with, with a policy that the central bank puts in, right when the shocks send you to the lower bound. Shocks send you to the lower bound. Here's the policy. Here's what happens. The red line is what you get in full information, and you can see that things just automatically adjust right away. The policy is perfectly credible. It works. You've taken out the inflation bias or the output bias from this framework. The blue line is what we do with learning in our model. And you can see at first you aren't really getting rid of too much of the bias, but as you go through time, agents see what the central bank is doing, they learn it, and eventually you can get rid of the bias in the model. Now this, of course, produces a lot of pretty good results. If you look at the full information case, agents know you're going to do a better job in the future, and through the standard dynamics and the new Keynesian model, it gets pulled forward into better responses today, and so you have higher output and inflation than you would otherwise in the base case. And the learning is somewhere in between. It eventually gets back up to the base case. The base case, the rational expectations case. Another thing you can see is there is some overshooting here a little bit, not as much as what we see in Daisuke and his co-authors' models, but there is a bit of something going on. It's not drastic. You're not seeing a recession that you would have in some of their examples, but there is a bit of this overshooting going on. The other thing you notice, there's some interesting bumps in this learning process, and I'm going to talk about those bumps in a bit. Okay. So the other thing that, just to point out quickly, is this model in this paper is a straight calendar-based forward guidance. I mean, there's the central bank goes out there, and everybody knows all the shocks in this model, and they say, okay, even though we would be out of the effective lower bound in period 21, we're going to hold it on, keep rates at 0 until period 28. Okay, that's the policy, and the green line tells you, boy, if that's credible, it's going to do a pretty good job. But if it's not credible, it's got some more problems. And so this, in some sense, this credibility is the analog of the full informational rational expectations view of things settling out. But I'll get back to this thing on the credibility a little bit later. Okay. Now, one thing that is the wrinkle in terms of learning policy in these models, so different than what Chris had and he and Andy when they were looking at learning policies, is you don't have any short-term policy rates to observe while you're at the ELB to use for inference, okay? And so that's a problem. We also notice the period before and after exiting the ELB are really highly informative. And particularly, before you exit the ELB, if you think you're going to exit under the old rule and you don't exit, you know you're in a different world with some likelihood, and you start adjusting what your parameters are. And then immediately after you exit the ELB, you start getting observations on the new policy, and that makes a big difference in how you estimate things. And so those were those bumps in that blue line I showed you, how you go through time and what you learn. Let's skip that one. Now, just quickly, another way of looking at how learning works in these models is that in all of these, someone's, you've got a posterior distribution, and that's how you're figuring out, you're using Bayesian updating to estimate the parameters theta. But the likely part of this looks like a Tobit regression. So as macroeconomists, we can tell our micro friends, hey, I too can estimate a Tobit. And that's what you end up in this model. So what happens is when the economy is deep in a recession, the systematic part of the Taylor rule is highly negative. That means that almost any shock you see is still not going to be big enough to throw you away from the ELB, and you're at that red dot to the far right. As the economy improves, though, you start moving along further, and you eventually get into the point where there's some slope into this likelihood function, and so when you start taking derivatives, they're not all zero. There's something else, and you start moving the parameters. And you're learning more about the process because now there are shocks that could push you above the ELB even if the systematic part of the likelihood doesn't get you there. Okay. So where does the policy gap come up in this current paper? There's a very big difference between what the central bank thinks its rule for the policy rate is and what the agents do. Okay? So the central bank on top says, we're going to hold at our calendar-based forward guidance, and when we exit, we're going to follow a policy rule that doesn't have any errors in it. And I apologize, that should be a lagged interest rate in the upper panel. They're just going to do what they do, okay? But agents see it differently. First of all, they have this different probability on what you're really going to see, if the central bank's going to hold on to the commitment or not. But there are also two error terms in here. And the first one, the epsilon MP, is just a standard straight monetary policy shock. But I star has to do with what you think the neutral rate is. Okay? And now this model is set up in deviations from steady state. So what this I star is saying is that I'm going to have these kind of changes from that long run neutral that vary over time. Because that rho is a fairly high number, these are going to be persistent changes. Okay? So what happens is you see, and producing the graph Daisuke showed, particularly looking at the one in the bottom, you see that agents really start putting in a lot of weight onto this idea that you've got this persistent change away from what the baseline rule that the central bank eventually is going to follow. And if you think about it, you've got rates getting down maybe fairly soon 0.5 to 1 percentage point below where you think they be, and because rho is 0.95 in that lasts a long time. So agents think that there's going to be low rates for a long time, and they pull a whole bunch of stuff forward, and you've got problems. So there are a couple things that I think would be really interesting to work on extensions in this model. One is because this persistent I star is really important. I think it'd be really interesting to put it into the central bank's reaction function too. Okay? And we know it's important. In the paper, they talk about this can be a stand-in for things like different deviations in the trend of inflation, temporary changes, but persistent changes in the inflation target, or R star changing over time in some kind of a stationary but persistent fashion. And we know central banks worry about it. I mean, low R star was in the ECB and the Fed statements when they changed frameworks. So I think it'd be interesting to see how the model works with that. And I could see it going a couple ways. One way is you might get rid of this sharp sharp differentiation in the functions when the Fed actually does exit it, which might get rid of some of the sharp decline in output. But on the other hand, you may get some really long-lived deviations between what agents see as the reaction function and what the central bank sees as the reaction function that could have you missing your inflation target after exit for a long time. The other thing has to do with modeling this credibility term. Right now it's exogenous. I think you can work on making it endogenous. It's really hard. If you read the appendix, you'll see why it is. But I think you maybe want to fix a couple other parameters and see how that plays out over time. Because I think intuitively we'd all think the longer that the central bank is in this situation, agents are going to thinking it's more credible to do it. And to finish up with some lessons, we find out from this paper, it's really very good stark example of how agents' perceptions on deviations of policy from where you want to go can change over time, and beware of the gaps. They can cause problems when the central bank returns to business as usual. Now, we're central bankers. We all look at what markets think we're doing and what their versions of policy are all the time, and we know all the difficulties and pitfalls in that. So it's something that we have to do, but it can be difficult to do. Another thing I think is this is not just an issue about the effective lower bound. We know we do policy deviations from standard rules all the time for risk management considerations. And these risks are identified, but not necessarily something you can quantify. And so in some ways, that risk management idea is the equivalent of this notional interest rate we can't see when the economy's at the effective lower bound. And so thinking about how that is affecting what agents see and how they're viewing the policy function versus what we think of it is pretty important. State-based guidance beats calendar-based guidance, that's an old one. But also the communication to avoid the policy gap in the first place is very important. And it's almost sounding kind of trite sometimes. We always come back to say we have to communicate well, we have to communicate well. But I think this paper is another great example of why we do have to communicate well to avoid these kinds of difficulties. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll have a few minutes for questions, but first, did you want to respond at all?
Thank you very much, Spence, for your insightful discussions and very useful comments. And I agree with your comments and your first comment about I-star actually. So maybe I didn't mention about the assumption of the simulation. There is no change in the actual monetary policy. So I-star in the monetary policy rule in deviations from steady state, it is actually zero. But agents, under law for long, agents start perceive lower value of I-star in the monetary policy rule. And from the viewpoint of agents, actually I-star can be decomposed as R-star and pi-star. But from the viewpoint of agents, what does matter is the combination of the two. And so, so agents pay attention to I-star. But if central banks somehow have another way of communications and I-star in the monetary policy rule, I think this can be interpreted as kind of a persistent shock-based forward guidance. And so that would complicate a model a bit, but a key message is that so as long as agents observe law for long, and agents cannot distinguish between actual monetary policy shocks and the possibility of their belief deviating from monetary policy rule. Under law for long, agents start to perceive that interest rates will be kept lower for longer, and this could be the source of volatility. And so about the calendar-based forward guidance, and yes, so it is calendar-based forward guidance, and so we could introduce state-dependent forward guidance. But again, a key message is that even with state-dependent forward guidance, the agents would perceive the lower for longer, and so that would be the source of volatility. Thank you.
Okay, so to kick off the questions, I've got John, and then I think 2 rows directly behind John, I can see another placard. Shintani. So go ahead, John.
Great, thanks. This is a really interesting paper, really great discussion as well. I guess I have a question about how to think about monetary policy strategy rather than, and this is kind of getting Spencer's discussion, rather than thinking about this as a forward guidance kind of situation. And so if say that a central bank was consistently or following going back to Athanasios's comment yesterday, some kind of nominal income or price level targeting rule. By the way, Athanasios's policy is essentially a nominal income targeting rule because it's deltas on both sides. So if you integrate it up, it's a level of nominal income effect as interest rates. So if you brought the price level in as a state variable into this system, how does that change this learning process? And how do you think about that versus the kind of policy rule you have? When I did something kind of with the zero lower bound and thinking about the learning process, I mean, there was a huge difference between having a policy rule that had the state variable kind of in there and therefore in the learning process versus having the inflation rate. And again, what you're trying to do is train people when you're away from the lower bound about what the reaction function is, so that when they're at the lower bound, they're basically they're doing what Spencer said. They don't get new information, but basically they understand maybe the fundamental structure. So my question is really just a technical one about the price level versus inflation rate, and does that matter for your analysis?
Dr. Williams, thank you very much for your comment. And maybe Spence may know a lot about price level targeting versus inflation, flexible inflation targeting under the zero lower bound. But actually, the paper mostly related to ours, Bodenstein and others, they consider a switch from flexible inflation targeting to price level targeting under the prolonged period of zero lower bound. And their message is that the learning is really slow. So even though the central bank announces price level targeting under the zero lower bound, it's very their learning is slow. So they continue believing a high likelihood of the monetary policy is conducted by flexible inflation targeting. And so I could introduce such the strategy in this framework, but my best guess at this moment is that at least initially there would be no change about their perception from their flexible inflation targeting rule to price level targeting rule. And so there would be, I'm not perfectly sure, but my best guess is that the belief mechanism on the deviation of monetary policy will still continue to hold.
So, my gut, John, tells me that it wouldn't change much, and the reason I'm thinking that is the paper that I have with Leo and Matthias is working with a flexible average inflation targeting. So that lagging average is a bit of a state variable that's a bit like a price level. I'm not positive, but that's my first reaction. Having a state variable certainly helps. The more information that you could give agents to hone in on would certainly help.
Go ahead, Mr. Shintani.
Thank you. You provided very nice model with a lot of different features in it. And in particular, I have a question related to the forward guidance part. And to prevent forward guidance puzzle, you had two main features. One is the imperfect credibility channel, I would say. And the other one is cognitive discounting part. And my question is which channel do you think is more plausible way of explaining this forward guidance? And related question is that if you use a data and say use Bayesian method to estimate the structural parameters, if these two features works in the same way, to all the variables, do you think you can identify the parameters that is a degree of credibility parameter and cognitive discount factor parameter.
Dr. Shintani, thank you very much for your question. And so in this model, as I showed you, so there is a discounting, additional discounting, and imperfect credibility about forward guidance. And in the baseline, there is discounting, but with perfect credibility about forward guidance in response to severe negative shock, actually inflation and output increase, still forward guidance puzzle, we are having that. And so in that sense, if you have a very low value of, very heavy discounting, maybe we could address the forward guidance puzzle. But in this model, what is the most relevant is the imperfect credibility, because it affects the process of learning. And finally, about identification, that is the big issue. I think at this moment, I don't have clear idea how to identify Q, parameter Q, and the parameter M. Thank you.
Okay, so I've got Athanasios and then Indrajit Roy, and you can ask both questions before we come back.
Thank you, Stephen. So it's a really beautiful paper that, as Spencer in the discussion highlighted at the very end, highlights the importance of communication, especially at the zero-low bound, that makes learning by anybody outside the central bank so much harder. What I'd like to ask is whether you have considered, in the context of thinking about monetary policy strategies, the role of reformulating policy away from the overnight rate to longer-term interest rates, and the potential value for improving learning of strategies similar to the Bank of Japan's yield curve control policy, or the RBA's 3-year yield target. Because we know that at the effective lower bound, one of the ways policy works, actually the main way policy works, is by the central bank doing whatever it needs to do to bring down longer term rates. So if you go long enough at the maturity, you can be signaling with actions, with data, the easing. And I wonder if in your model, if there is value to that. So have you considered modifying the model, or would this be an extension to the model to see whether a longer-term target would solve the communication problem that you're identifying?
Thank you. Very nice paper and very beautiful paper on belief gap. And I like your presentation, also a presentation by discussion. My question is on empirical section of your paper. During, I understand your data was up to November 2024. So that includes COVID period also. Now, COVID is an interesting scenario they pose to econometrician, in the sense of, during COVID, producer wanted to produce and consumer wanted to consume, but because of COVID protocol, nobody could do that things, and output basically dropped, especially for many countries. I do not know about Japan. How did you adjust your COVID-related shock in your potential output estimation or something like that? Because artificially production was fall below its potential level. So how did you handle that COVID-related period data in your estimation?
Thank you for the comments. And so about complementing short-term interest rate rule with possibly with using long-term interest rates, I think in the model we can compute long-term interest rates in a non-ELB regime, and under the effective lower bound regime, at least long-term interest rate, if you take the duration of, say, 10 years, and then the interest rates are still positive. And so if you come up with a rule that is consistent with the short-term interest rate policy under the non-ELB regime, and then if the agents believe that then agents can believe the long-term interest rate rule that is consistent with short-term interest rate rule, even under the effective lower bound. I think that's that could address the belief gap in the model. But I can imagine that in practice, it's a bit hard. It would be difficult to use two policy tools and short-term interest rates and long-term interest rates as a strategy when interest rates are both positive. And about COVID, COVID incident in the estimation, actually we don't take care of COVID. We just use the data as they are and estimate the model. And actually, the empirical part was taken care of my co-author, who is sitting next to Spence, Koji. And so we construct potential GDP using the current potential GDP estimated by the BOJ. And for the forecast, we just extend the current GDP, potential GDP growth rate. We just extrapolate the potential GDP. But I agree that if there is something abnormal in the data, we may need to take care of that. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Yuri and then Andrea on the other side.
Thank you. Very quickly, one thing I wanted to mention is a paper I did with Dimitris Georgarakis and a few other people, where we did a randomized control trial and we presented people with different pieces of forward guidance. For example, you tell people something about the current policy rate, then another treatment group is going to be told about the current rate and 1 year ahead, then another treatment group would be told about the current rate 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead, and so you can see what's the marginal value of forward guidance for all sorts of beliefs that people have and also for their actions. And in this randomized control trial, we found that basically policy communication beyond the first year makes no difference whatsoever. So the marginal value of telling people about the path of policy in year 2, 3, 4, longer run basically doesn't matter for anything for the beliefs that people have and also for the choices that they make. I think, in the context of your paper, it means you have to use a very low value of M, a lot of discounting, to resolve the forward guidance puzzle and also sort of make a connection with this evidence. And maybe this should be the baseline in the paper where you have a lot of discounting, not just as a robustness check. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize, I have a bit of a technical question, but I think it gets to the heart of the mechanism behind your paper. The result you show is that under learning during the prolonged period of ELB, agents start to believe that the notional neutral rate must be lower than what it actually is, right? But during an ELB episode, learning is a very skilled process because agents can only learn about the right side of the prior. So they put some positive probability on notional rate being positive, and instead they observe ELB, so the only thing they can learn is that it must be 0 or negative. So the posterior should assign 0 probability to any positive value of the notional rate because they just observe it's actually 0. So again, it is a very skewed learning. They only learn about one side. Instead, your posterior probability distribution is constrained to be, by assumption, to be a normal. This implies that the mean of the posterior distribution is forced to be pushed to the right, because that's the only way you can. And from these mechanisms, you get that the results that agents lower the posterior mean estimates of I star. So I wonder whether just relaxing this normality would essentially changes the result, because you don't need to be moving the mean of the distribution just because you make it a very skewed posterior. That's the problem.
Quick answer. Yuri, thank you very much for let me realize the RCT papers and the possibility that in the interpretation of my model Q, the degree of credibility is actually low under the RCT experiments. And so I definitely look at the papers, and that enhance my calibration of the parameter Q. Thank you. And about technicality, I agree. So the assumption of normality is made for addressing computation burden, and so this can be relaxed in principle, but it takes a bit of time, and so but I take your point. Your point is well taken. So need for relaxing assumption. Thank you.
Okay, we're getting a bit pressed for time here. I've got Kasumasa Awada in the back.
Yes,
and
thank you very much. I have quick 2 questions. Bank of Japan made the commitment on the overshooting of monetary base in order to move out from the deflationary equilibrium. And also Federal Reserve adopted the average flexible inflation rate target to avoid the risk of facing the effective lower bound. My first question is whether these commitment or policy framework seems to me to widen the mind gap among the public. So this is the first way, whether is this correct or not, and this is the first question. Second one is looking at your perceived neutral rate in Japan. It's lower than the actual current 0.5% policy rate. That implies this is tightening. So the second question.
actually so I think we'll collect one final round of questions and then we'll wrap it up. So at the back I've got Etsuro Sioji and Shinon Shirasuka, and then Chris.
Okay, so this is Etsuro. Thank you for Daisuke for a great presentation. 2 quick questions. Question number 1. So in this model, what matters is the public's misperception about the actual Earth star, or is it the misperception about what the central bank thinks what the Earth star is? Because if it's the latter, the central bank could just tell the public. But I'm wondering that after so many years we spent at the zero lower bound, maybe even the central bank is not quite sure what the Earth star is. So that's the question number 1. Question number 2, would it be conceivable to extend this model to include some kind of financial frictions of some kind? Because if people think that the interest rate will remain low for longer, they will start borrowing like hell, and at the time of exit, lots of people will be surprised, and that's going to create some kind of a financial turmoil, which could be far more devastating to the economy. Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Thank you very much, Shigenori Shiratsuka, Keio University. And it's a very nice idea to examine low for long strategy by considering the imperfect credibility about the policy commitment. I have 2 questions, very quick questions. One is, so how the inflation expectations, long-run inflation expectations, inflation targets are treated in this model? So pi inflation is deviation from steady state, but in those models, so how they are treated? And also, I'd like to see the much more long-run impact of the simulation results. So it seems to me impact on the interest rate, inflation rate seems to be very persistent. Maybe how those variables evolves after 40 quarters.
Go ahead, Chris.
So very nice and interesting paper. I was just going to suggest that you might look at the Federal Reserve's experience in 2015 with liftoff just for an additional point of comparison, a really quick look at the Teal book suggests that there was some modest gap between market expectations and the Fed's internal projections, where market expectations were a bit below the Fed's. But I think it's worth looking at. Thanks.
Okay, so in total there are 7 questions and comments, and I don't know if I can quickly answer, but regarding Iwata-san's 2 comments, yes, in this model, it's very simple. I make it intentionally as simple as possible, so there is only forward guidance. There is no overshooting commitment, and so. But in any way, if even in the model we can add other things, but as long as agents have, imperfectly believe what central bank is announcing, then I think this belief gap channel will be present in the model. And about I-star estimation, so this is the long-term perceived I-star using professional forecast data. And we did that because the data are available. But in practice, we need, of course, to pay attention to the firms and households and individual, expectation, their views on, neutral rates and what they think about the monetary policy and the real economy. And so from this result, it's not, it's hard to say whether 50 basis point is tight or loose. And about Shioji-san's comment, so what does matter from the viewpoint of agents is the combination of R-star and pi-star in the monetary policy rule. So I combine them as I-star, nominal neutral rate. And your second question, so we discuss in this paper the agents, market participants, households, and the firms' views on monetary policy, what they think about what the central bank considers, and so this is what we focus. But in principle, we, the central bankers, also learn and consider what's going on in the real economy, and so there are potentially two-sided learning, but it's above the scope of the paper, so beyond the scope. And Shiratsuka-san, thank you for your comments. And so in this model, inflation targeting is set at 2%, so it's constant at steady state value, and all variables are expressed in deviations from the target, and eventually I-star in deviation from the steady state in the monetary policy rule goes to 0, converges to that target level. And yes, I can look at the results for after 40 periods, for example. Yes. And finally, Chris, thank you for your comments. I look at the Teal book. Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our session. So let's thank both our presenter and discussant.